it really touches me to hear that talk I gave reached so far and wide and was had some influence in. So I'm really delighted to join you here today. I'm sorry, I'm not very good at speaking and trying to arrange my slideshow at the same time. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Brilliant. So my name's Charlie, and I'm a conservation scientist at the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology at the University of Kent. So my main concern has always been the ecological crisis, the destruction of nature. Over the last few years, I've been teaching an undergraduate course on climate change, and I've become even more worried by the climate crisis than I was about the ecological crisis. And this has this growing knowledge I've had about both crises has forced me into becoming an activist. So that's what I'd like to speak to you about today. What I believe is the role of scientists in this planetary emergency. So I know you all know about this planetary emergency that we're in, but just to give you a brief recap, perhaps there are some on Facebook that don't know all about it. So our planet is heating incredibly fast. These warming stripes show changes in temperature on an annual basis. And over the last few years, we're starting to see the impact of that warming more and more frequently. So we've reached a global average of 1.1 degrees above pre-industrial temperatures. And just last year, this was starting to have some severe impacts. So we saw the hottest day ever recorded on planet Earth in California. In June, it was 38 degrees in Arctic Siberia. So it was as hot in the Arctic Circle as it has ever been in the UK. We've seen extraordinary wildfires across North and South America, in Russia. 27 million acres of forest burned in Siberia last year. And of course, we heard about Australia the year before. In China, 4 million people were displaced by floods. There were another 4 million people in India and Nepal. We had the busiest ever Atlantic hurricane season. There were 30 named storms, and they had to move on to the Greek alphabet to name these storms because they run out of letters. And we saw the strongest ever storm in the Philippines. That's just at 1.1 degrees. Before the end of the century, we're looking probably at 4 degrees under a high emission scenario. And of course, 4 degrees averaged across the planet means very different temperatures in different places in the planet. If we look in the Arctic, 4 degrees globally looks more like 10 degrees or more in the Arctic. And of course, this will have huge impact on human systems and on the natural world. So for some reason, this map isn't very clearly defined on my slideshow. I apologize for that. But this map highlights the problem of human migration that will be caused by climate change. So the areas in black here are places that have a mean annual temperature of greater than 29 degrees centigrade, and they currently cover less than 1% of the Earth's land surface. And at such temperatures, human life is essentially impossible. What's really concerning is that by 2070, under a high emission scenario, areas with a mean annual temperature of greater than 29 degrees will have expanded to cover all the area with brown hatching here. So that's all of northern half of South America, Northern Africa and the Horn of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, much of India, Southeast Asia, and Northern Australia. This is 1/3 of the current global human population are currently living in places that will be uninhabitable in 50 years' time. The big risk of climate change for humanity, of course, is the risk of societal collapse, the collapse of human civilization. There's increasing research on this. This is one causal link diagram from a paper published last month, and showing that the main risk of collapse of civilization may come from food insecurity, what we call multiple breadbasket failure, climate change causing the collapse of food production in several of the world's major breadbaskets at once. Of course, climate change is also impacting the natural world, and many of our most important, our richest biomes may not survive beyond the end of this century. So we know about polar sea ice, of course, but it's rapidly becoming clear that tropical forests may not survive climate change because of the drying effects and the vulnerability to fire that this causes. We also know that coral reefs, which are the rainforests of the sea, they cover less than 1% of the oceans, but contain 50% of marine life. They are also threatened because they are highly vulnerable to warm oceans. So we're talking about a world without tropical forests and without coral reefs by the end of this century. So that's the climate crisis. We're also suffering an ecological crisis with the destruction of nature. So, the destruction and degradation of habitats, the over-harvesting of many species, ecological disruptions caused by the disappearance of some species from within ecosystems. We have problems of invasive species. We have increasing pollution problems, and not just plastic pollution and chemical pollution, but the systematic poisoning of our agricultural landscapes. And then, of course, there's climate change and its equally evil twin, ocean acidification. Ocean acidification is not caused by climate change, but it's also caused by the increase of atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations. And it means that creatures that live in the ocean that secrete a shell, things that make a calcium carbonate shell, like mollusks and crustaceans, they're not able to do that in an acidic ocean. So we fear the collapse of oceanic food chains in the future. These two crises are two sides of the same coin, and they feed into each other. So climate change is the biggest threat to the natural world. It threatens the natural world directly, as we saw with the coral reefs and the tropical forests, but it also threatens the natural world indirectly through human reactions to climate change. How we mitigate climate change and how we adapt to climate change is causing an additional pressure on nature. At the same time, our destruction of nature accelerates climate change, and it undermines our capacity to survive climate change. So this is an emergency. It really is. And, over nearly 14,000 scientists now have signed the World Scientists' warning of a climate emergency. There were 161 signatories from Sweden. I'm sure there are people in this room who have signed this declaration of a climate emergency. So the question now is what we do about this as scientists. We have generated the knowledge that has allowed us to understand the severity of the problem. We have also generated solutions to this problem that society is largely choosing not to implement. So what do we do about it? Well, first, we need to consider what this word emergency means. When Bill Ripple and colleagues published that paper, the warning of a climate emergency, they chose this word very carefully, because an emergency is an urgent situation that requires us to stop what we are doing and to take urgent action to address the emergency at hand. And it means in an emergency, we don't do things in the normal way anymore. It means we act, as Greta Thunberg suggests, as if our house is on fire. And if my neighbor's house over there was on fire, I would not behave in the normal way. I would not send them a text message to ask if it's okay if I come round. And then I would not ring the doorbell to ask, to wait for them to allow me in. I would run over there and I would kick down the door and I would try and rescue whoever was inside, because that is what we do in an emergency. But despite the fact that scientists are saying it's an emergency, most of us are not acting like it. And I think this is partly because we feel that as scientists, we are already doing what we can to make the required change happen. We are already acting to make a better world by providing information. But clearly that is not enough. Clearly the situation is still getting worse. So we have to re-examine our assumptions. Is what we are doing as scientists enough to make the change we need? And I think we need to examine our theories of change. And there are two key theories of change, that sort of unspoken theories of change that scientists have. The first, I think, is that our job is to generate information. And if we generate information, our society's leaders will use that information to make wise decisions. They will make decisions that benefit humanity. They will make decisions for the greater good. Our second assumption is that if we warn people of the consequences of inaction, then people will force their leaders to take the required action. And you don't see these theories of change written down. They're unspoken, but I'm convinced that many of us as scientists, we sort of operate under these assumptions, but these assumptions are false. So the first theory of change, that if we generate information, our leaders will use that information to make wise decisions. This is demonstrably not true. Governments do not listen to scientists because they are driven by an imperative of economic growth, and they respond primarily to corporate lobbyists. They also respond to public pressure, which we'll come to in a moment. So, in 2020, the oil and gas sector spent $136 million in political contributions, and a further $110 million on lobbying of politicians in just one country, in just the USA. This is money spent by the fossil fuel industry to influence politicians. Scientists do not influence politicians in the same way. And of course, that's just, I've just highlighted lobbying money from the oil and gas industry. That doesn't include the coal industry. That doesn't include the plastics lobby. That doesn't include the agricultural pesticides lobby. All of these lobbies that are spending lots and lots of money to prevent political change. And we come here to what George Monbiot calls the pollution paradox. The dirtier an industry is, the more it has to spend on lobbying governments to prevent itself from being regulated out of existence. And that means that governments tends to be, their campaign finance tends to be dominated by the very dirtiest industries, and governments tends to govern for the very dirtiest industries. And we know this assumption that leaders will act on the science is false, because we can see it in the outcomes, real world outcomes. There has been delay and delay and delay in having legislation to limit climate change, and as a result, greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere continue to rise, despite 4 decades of scientific warnings. Our other theory of change is that if we warn the public about the necessity of action, the public will force their leaders to take the required action. But the thing is, those same fossil fuel industries and other dirty industries that are directly paying politicians, they are also investing heavily in the climate change counter movement organizations and science denialism. 4 decades of trying to create doubt about the science of climate change, create doubt in the minds of the public that this was something that was required. And as a result, the public does not demand the action that is required from our leaders. So we come to the realization that science alone cannot trigger the transformative change required at the urgent speed required, because it ignores the processes that most powerfully influence political and policy change, and it does not address the forces that are so heavily invested in preventing the required change. And of course, many of us already recognize that the work we do as scientists is not enough. That's why in our spare time as private citizens, we also write letters to politicians. We also sign petitions to try and achieve change. And we also, if things get really desperate, we will go on a sanctioned march from A to B. We will, in other words, we adopt advocacy positions and we engage in traditional campaigning. But we know that the traditional campaigning is also not working. If the traditional campaigning had been working, then we would not be continuing to see rises in atmospheric greenhouse gas concentration. So clearly it's not working. So we have to ask ourselves, if our science that we carry out as professionals is not enough, and if the campaigning that we do as private citizens is not enough, then is there something else we can do that is more effective? And I believe, and I think history demonstrates, that there is another method to trigger radical social change, and that is non-violent civil disobedience, direct action. When we think of many of the most prominent social changes that took place in the 20th century, the struggle for universal suffrage, for votes for women, the struggle for independence from empire, and the struggle for civil rights for people of color. These were struggles that were achieved in large part through non-violent civil disobedience. And the people who engaged in that civil disobedience, they were wildly unpopular at the time. They were hated in the press. And they were, people considered them to be dangerous dissenters. But today, we recognize them as heroes because they triggered the changes that were needed. And history has proved them right. For the last 3 years or so, as the impacts of climate change and the destruction of nature have become so apparent, we have seen the birth of popular environmental civil disobedience movements. Of course, there has been environmental civil disobedience for decades, but it has never achieved mass movement status until the last few years. And this was this started partially in Sweden with Greta Thunberg and the global youth strike movement, which she inspired. And we're on a Fridays for Future Day today, so there are youth all over the world striking for climate today. And in the UK, there has been, alongside that, there has been Extinction Rebellion. And of course, there are other movements in other parts of the world. Extinction Rebellion is also growing to be a global movement, just as the youth strike movement is. And over the last few years, I've been so inspired by these movements that I am moving away from research myself and dedicating more and more of my time to activism. So I engage with activism. I engage in activism with scientists, with Extinction Rebellion and a group called Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. And I've written a few papers and articles in journals like this one in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, highlighting the need for scientists to move beyond words and take part in action, move from publications to public actions. And this is why I think we need to do that. So firstly, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the impacts of civil disobedience movements over the last few years. And I can only really talk about the impacts in the UK. Of course, it's difficult to demonstrate causality, but you know, there haven't been any robust studies to try and demonstrate this. But what we've seen over the last 3 years in the UK, as you know, following the rise of the civil disobedience movement, is we have seen unparalleled media coverage about climate and environmental issues. This picture on the right here is from before the last general election, where we had a leaders' debate on climate on national TV. This was completely unimaginable 2 years ago, but it happened. Prior to coronavirus, the environment grew to become the third biggest concern for British voters, above crime, above immigration, above the economy even. And even despite the pandemic, the concern for the environment has not declined. And so we're seeing a change in the media landscape. We're seeing a change in the public conversation, and we're starting to see a change in the political rhetoric as well. So 2/3 of local authorities, so city councils and county councils in the UK, have declared a climate emergency. The UK Parliament declared a climate and environmental emergency in 2019, 1 week after Extinction Rebellion shut down 5 sites in London for 10 days. And the UK became the first the first nation to enshrine a net zero target in law. There have now been 8 nations that have followed suit and enshrined a zero target in law. So since the youth strikes and Extinction Rebellion started, they have completely changed the conversation on the climate and ecological crisis. And then just last month in the UK, we saw this was the front page of a major right-wing newspaper. This is, this is a newspaper that has spent years either ignoring the climate crisis or pretending it's not happening. But last month they had this as their front page. Of course, this is, to an extent, this is greenwashing. But nevertheless, regardless of what their the true intentions of this right-wing newspaper are, the fact that they have a front page like this shows that popular civil disobedience movements have completely changed the conversation. So these movements are effective. They seem to be starting to trigger a change that decades of science has been unable to achieve, and decades of traditional campaigning has been unable to achieve. So why should scientists join these movements? First is that it lends them authority and legitimacy. Very often, the powers that be it the media or politicians, they try to dismiss protest movements as hippies or unemployed people or just not members of mainstream society. They try to persuade the public that these people are not like you. By scientists joining these movements or vocally supporting them, firstly, we demonstrate that these movements are backed by the science, that what they are saying is true. And secondly, we demonstrate that that very serious people, very respectable people, if you like, are also parts of these movements. It's not just hippies. And I think it's particularly important for scientists to join these movements, because scientists are the ones saying that it's an emergency. We are the ones saying that we have to do something, but we are not acting like it. And to me, that sends a very powerful signal. If scientists tell everybody that it's an emergency and we have to act, but we don't act like it's an emergency ourselves, then why should people believe us? If we're not acting like it's an emergency, how bad can it be? One of the big concerns, I think, for scientists is that if we adopt a position, if we engage in advocacy or activism, there is a concern that that will reduce our credibility as scientists, that we will no longer be detached. Well, actually, research demonstrates that this is not the case. The public does not tend to feel a reduction in scientists' credibility if they adopt a position. There are, I think there are very strong personal reasons why, as individuals, it's important to engage in actions that feel like they might have an impact. You know, I'm sure many of you, just like me, suffer from ecological grief, seeing the destruction of our beautiful natural world that we love so much. And many of us also suffer from climate anxiety. We know what is coming. We are worried for our futures, not just our children's futures, our own futures. Well, one of the things that, you know, can help us deal with this mental health burden of the knowledge we have is taking action. And then I think another very important reason why we should support these movements or engage with them is that we have a moral obligation. Not only do those that have knowledge have a moral obligation to act, but also we must remember that these civil disobedience movements, they are the result of our words. We have spent decades warning the world that we are in a very bad situation and that we must be worried and that we must act. Now people are so worried by what we have told them that they have taken to the streets to fight for our world. So how can we not be there in support of them? This is our doing. We made people this worried. We have to support them. And I just think it's a moral duty. And of course, it's a moral duty to act just as citizens, but we are not just citizens. We are scientists. We are people that society holds in a position of authority. So that means not just do we have a responsibility, but we have power. If we would have power joining these movements just as private citizens, then we have twice as much power, 5 times as much power, joining them as scientists because of the authority with which society holds us in. So you know, these are just a few of the reasons why I think we, you know, should join these movements. Another one is that, I don't know, for me personally, these movements are what I have always been waiting for. Ever since I was a young child, I have been concerned about the destruction of our planet. And ever since I was a young child, I've just thought it was the strangest thing that the general public isn't as worried about this as I am. Well, now they are. Now, finally, people are taking to the streets. And you know this. I feel we are obliged. So if you feel even slightly like me, I'm afraid I haven't done my research, and I don't know that much about opportunities for joining science activist groups in Sweden. But I'd just like to tell you about some global ones that are associated with Extinction Rebellion. So I'm sure you're all familiar with Extinction Rebellion, but there are two scientist groups that are affiliated with Extinction Rebellion. So Scientists for XR, this is us pictured on the right here in Trafalgar Square in London. We are a group of scientists that have several purposes. One is to provide the scientific foundation and fact checking for the Extinction Rebellion movement. And another is to lend our support to the Extinction Rebellion movement as a scientific voice. There's a second group called Scientist Rebellion, which is a bit more involved in direct action. And Scientist Rebellion's objective is to persuade scientists to engage in civil disobedience. So Scientist Rebellion tends to target scientific institutions like the Royal Academy in the UK or Springer Nature, the publishers of the Nature journals, to try and persuade them to act on their own warnings. Of particular interest, the Scientist Rebellion are organizing a global scientist rebellion next week from 25th to 28th March. There are over 100 scientists globally taking action in, I don't know, 8 or 10 countries now. There are 3 actions that are being undertaken. One is pasting scientific papers to buildings of scientific institutions to say, these are your own words about the urgency of this situation, please take action. So that is potentially an arrestable action. There are also going to be hunger strikes or fasting for those that can't take part in arrestable actions. There's fasting in solidarity, and there is also educational disobedience. So if you teach, then take the opportunity to teach your students about civil disobedience. If anybody has any questions about how to get engaged in this, of course, I'd be delighted to please contact me anytime. And yeah, I think we just have to remember that, you know, we like to change the world through our research, but this is an emergency situation. And of course, research is important, but it is not enough anymore. And we have to do more. So thank you very much for allowing me to come and speak to you today. Thank you.